A Liberal Senator James Paterson. Thanks for joining us, James. First up, are you concerned about the brutal responses we're seeing from Victorian police in a range of issues and a range of circumstances?
Good afternoon, Chris. I thought that was a very balanced editorial of yours, which carefully considered the very troubling evidence that we're seeing in the form of a series of videos which appear to show very heavy-handed tactics by police. Now, overwhelmingly, the responsibility for that rests with the Andrews government, but I've also been troubled by some of the rhetoric coming out of senior police, including the Assistant Commissioner Luke Cornelius, who's referred to some of these protesters as tinfoil hat-wearing brigade and said they were batshit crazy. That's quite dehumanising language to use about your fellow Victorians and your fellow citizens and the people who police are supposed to protect. And I think it encourages police to hold the people they're supposed to protect with contempt, and it licenses some of these very tough tactics. So I am troubled by this. I think it's undermining community support for policing and for the police force, and I think overwhelmingly police members don't deserve that and are upstanding citizens who try very hard to do a very difficult job. But let's remember they're enforcing laws to enforce mask wearing outside, prevent people from going out after curfew and protesting. The kind of things we never would have ever imagined police would be enforcing, and I think they're doing so in a way that's really testing the bonds of community support.
Yeah, you've got to remember that nobody's experienced this level of police control before. A lot of us would argue that no one should have to experience this, but we say that people should adhere to the law, and there's no doubt that the police are being confronted with some idiots, some protests they don't like. But their job, they're trained to deal with this and not escalate. We saw them go out of their way not to escalate any situations with Black Lives Matter protesters and the like. Has it reached the point where the Premier needs to sit down with the Police Commissioner, or at least maybe say something publicly? You just need to take the temperature out of these confrontations. You need to draw a line at dragging women out of the front seats of their cars, at handcuffing pregnant women in their homes.
Yeah, well said, Chris. And I think you're absolutely right about that. I think the Premier does need to show leadership. And there certainly are some crazy conspiracy theories out there. You should see my email inbox. There's no question about that. But the reason why those theories are out there is because people are afraid. They're genuinely scared. Their lives have changed massively in the last few months in ways they could never have previously imagined. And they're looking for explanations for this. And sometimes they find some comfort or solace in conspiracy theories. But what they actually need is a bit of compassion, a bit of decency from their political leaders and from the police force. And I don't think we've seen that at all from the Premier or from the senior leaders of the police force who've seen contempt for their own fellow citizens. I think that's a very disappointing thing.
I think the whole approach is wrong, because I think what Daniel Andrews is saying, he says it repeatedly, that there is no alternative. It's my way or the highway, and all the experts say that. Now, we know that's absolute bunkum. We know there's a whole range of ways you can manage this, and it's about picking your best compromise way through. Yet he says it's all, there is no alternative, and he's laying down the heavy arm of the law to enforce it instead of sort of engaging in community response to the chosen path. I mean, there needs to be a serious debate, doesn't there, about the various options before Daniel Andrews, and we're starting to see big business in Victoria get very frustrated about the lack of debate, the lack of consideration of other options.
Well, Daniel Andrews has been saying for months that all of the policies he's putting in place are based on medical advice and scientific evidence. And we now know, at least in the case of the nighttime curfew, that that's not the case. It wasn't requested either by the Chief Health Officer or the police force. We don't know who it was dreamed up by. Daniel Andrews can't even say who originated that idea. And we clearly know that it's not only based on medical advice, because New South Wales and Queensland are not applying the same standards and the same tests for community transmission for implementing restrictions on their citizens. And I don't think it's because the medical advice or the scientific evidence is any different in New South Wales or Queensland, or the virus behaves any differently. It's because there are trade-offs, and different political leaders have decided to make different trade-offs in balancing the cost to society and the economy, people's mental health, and as well as trying to prevent the virus. So Daniel Andrews has to take responsibility for the decisions that he's taken and not hide behind medical advice. They're his decisions and he's alone, and he needs to adequately explain what the rationale is for them.
James Paterson, I want to move on to China and some issues that have come up in relation to our relationship with China. Sharry Markson has broken another exclusive story in The Australian today about a group called Shenzhen Zhenhua Data. There's been a data leak about all the open source intelligence they've been gathering around the world, and it focuses on prominent people such as politicians' family as being targeted by this intelligence gathering. Now, it's open source intelligence. In other words, they're assembling what's been reported in the media, what's available publicly. But do you have any concerns about this?
These were really important reports this morning, Chris, and a very timely reminder for all Australians, particularly those who are involved in politics or the media or business or journalism, or those who are closely adjacent to it by being their immediate family members, that anything that you do put online can be hoovered up by some very sophisticated actors, whether they are state-based actors, as it appears to be in this instance, or state-linked actors, or just private companies who do it for their own reasons. And you can actually build quite a powerful picture about a person from their online postings, whether that's Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or other software. And I think absolutely Australians should be concerned about this. And I know the government takes cybersecurity incredibly seriously. And of course, it does take on a whole different picture when it appears to be linked to an authoritarian government, as the Chinese Communist Party is, which is probably the most sophisticated, technologically authoritarian state in the world. It uses these tactics very successfully in a very sophisticated way on its own citizens. The idea that it's engaging in mass surveillance of Australian citizens, I think, is very troubling.
So this company, Shenzhen Zhenhua Data, they linked to the Chinese government, and is anything they're doing illegal?
Well, that's not yet clear, Chris, from the available evidence. And as you say, it's possibly based mainly on open source material. I haven't seen the database myself, and I don't know exactly what's on there. And perhaps we'll get a clearer picture in the coming days about whether it's only open source or whether there's also other information available about people on there. If it is open source, it may not be unlawful, although there were some reports that there are so-called collection centres in some countries. One in Australia has not been identified. But Australians make up a disproportionate number of people on this list. Of the 240,000 odd already who've been analysed, about 30,000, 35,000 of those were Australians, which is many more than the 10,000 Indians or 10,000 UK citizens, and proportional to population, quite a lot more than the 50,000 Americans who are on there. So it shows that Australia is a real area of interest for this company, and we should all be very worried about that.
Spot on. And just finally, we're all concerned about those Australian journalists who had to be spirited out of China last week. Does it look now like that was a retaliation for ASIO checking out Chinese journalists in Australia?
The short and honest answer to that, Chris, is we really don't know. It's impossible to get inside the mind of the Chinese Communist Party and the Ministry of State Security who conducted these raids on Australian journalists. But we certainly know that the Australian journalists themselves did nothing wrong at all to warrant that kind of attention and interest. And it's really up to the Chinese Communist Party to explain what its rationale was. Thanks for joining us, James. I hope lockdown is treating you well. Thank you, Chris. It is.